She gave him everything: her name, her future, the years she would never get back. And tonight, in front of every lord and lady in the empire, he handed all of it back to her like something broken beyond use. Lady Seraphine Voss stood in that hall and did not scream, did not beg. She simply stood there while the world decided she was nothing. But here is what no one in that ballroom saw coming. The night that was supposed to bury her was the night a king walked through the door looking for exactly one person. Stay until the end. You will not regret it. Drop your city in the comments below, so I know where my people are watching from. The Hall of Veyrath had been built to make people feel small. That was the honest truth of it. The architectural intention stripped bare of all the official language about grandeur and imperial dignity. The vaulted ceiling climbed so high that candlelight dissolved before it reached the stone, swallowed whole by a darkness that pressed down like weather. The marble floors were polished to a mirror finish, pale as a winter lake, so that every person who walked across them saw themselves reflected beneath their own feet. A constant, wordless reminder that they existed at the Empire's pleasure, and not the other way around. The columns were carved from single pieces of black granite hauled down from the Scale Mountains at a cost that had allegedly broken 3 noble houses just in the hauling. Everything about the hall whispered the same message in a voice too low to argue with. You are not the point. The Empire is the point. You are decoration. Lady Seraphine Voss had always understood this. She had grown up understanding it in the particular way that daughters of minor houses understood everything. Not through proclamation, but through experience, through the way invitations arrived a week late and seating arrangements placed her family near the columns rather than the center, through the specific mathematics of being useful enough to invite and unimportant enough to ignore. She had accepted the terms. She had dressed accordingly, kept her voice low and her opinions quiet, and she had believed, with the particular stubbornness of a woman who had nothing else to hold on to, that Cassian Dorn saw something in her that the rest of the room had missed. That belief lasted exactly as long as it took him to walk into the Hall of Veyrath with Alara Vane on his arm. Seraphine stood near the east wall where she had been standing for the better part of an hour, near a column that smelled of cold stone and whatever expensive candle wax the palace burned by the hundredweight. She had arrived early because Cassian had sent her a note that morning. "Meet me there," he had written, before the doors open, before the crowd, and she had read it 3 times and felt something loosen in her chest that she recognized as relief, the fragile and embarrassing kind. She had worn the gray dress with the silver embroidery at the collar because he had once told her the gray made her eyes look like river ice before the thaw, which she had understood was not precisely a compliment but had accepted as something better than nothing. She had waited. The doors opened. The crowd came in. She waited. Then Cassian came in, and Alara Vane was on his arm, and Alara Vane was wearing new jewelry and laughing at something the lord beside her had said, and Cassian's hand was at the small of Alara's back, in the particular way that means this is mine, and everyone should understand that this is mine. Seraphine had stood very still. He had not looked at her column. She had told herself, in the first minutes, that there was an explanation. She catalogued possibilities the way someone catalogues exits in a burning building, quickly, with diminishing options. He had been pressured into this appearance. He was playing some political game she did not have the information to understand yet. The note had been sent by someone else, or she had misread it, or the day had been wrong. She stood near her column and watched the possibility space collapse, one explanation at a time, while the hall filled with people who were watching Cassian and Alara Vane move through the crowd with the easy confidence of 2 people who had already decided their future. She made herself breathe. She was still breathing carefully and without sound when Lady Mira Holt materialized out of the crowd with the specific social radar of a woman who had spent decades identifying the precise moment when someone was too wounded to defend themselves. Seraphine, Mira said her name like it was a mildly interesting object she had found on the floor. "I had wondered if you would come tonight." "I was invited," Seraphine said. "Yes, of course." Mira's eyes tracked to Cassian and Alara and back again, with the casual efficiency of a woman filing information she already had. "It must be difficult to watch him move on so quickly. Although, I suppose, given the differences in their situations, Alara Vane's father controls the merchant guilds, and the Voss name carries, well, She smiled. "You understand." "I understand perfectly," Seraphine said. What she understood was that her lungs had gone strange, like the air in the room had developed texture. What she understood was that the silver embroidery at her collar, which she had spent an extra 20 minutes deciding on that morning, now felt like something a child would wear to an event they did not know was not meant for them. She kept her face arranged correctly. She had been arranging her face correctly since she was 11 years old and had watched her father's political prospects collapse over the course of a single dinner party. She knew how to keep the bones of her expression in order while the inside of her went somewhere else entirely. But then Cassian looked up from across the room. He found her. Their eyes met over 40 feet of marble and candlelight and people who meant nothing to either of them, and he held her gaze for a moment that lasted long enough to be deliberate, and then he turned away and said something in Alara's ear that made Alara laugh, and the sound carried. Mira Holt had already drifted elsewhere, satisfied. Seraphine counted to 5. Then she moved away from her column, keeping to the edge of the hall, navigating by instinct toward the terrace doors at the far end where the crowd thinned out, and the night air came through gaps in the stone. She moved slowly enough not to appear to be fleeing, which was the last piece of dignity she had available to her, and she intended to preserve it. Nobody was watching her. That was the particular mercy of being decorative and unimportant. At least the audience found other things to look at. She was almost to the terrace doors when she heard Cassian's voice. He was close. He was closer than she had realized because the crowd had shifted, and he was maybe 15 feet away, standing with a cluster of lords whose names she knew. The way you knew the names of geographical features, not because they mattered to you personally, but because they were part of the landscape of existing in this world. His back was mostly to her. He was speaking with the comfortable volume of someone who did not believe anyone relevant was near enough to hear. "Made a mistake, frankly," Cassian was saying. "She was never the right fit. You know how it is. You make decisions when you're young, and you have incomplete information." A pause that contained the sound of wine being swallowed. "The Voss family is a dead branch. Everyone knows it. I should have seen it sooner." Seraphine stopped walking. One of the lords made a sympathetic sound. "Alara," Cassian continued, "understands the world. Seraphine understood sentiment. There is a significant difference between the two when you're trying to build something that lasts." She had been abandoned twice in the space of 40 minutes. The first time with a turned back across a crowded room. The second time with a 15-foot radius and his voice, which she recognized in the dark, which she had trusted in the dark, telling men she did not know that she was a mistake he was rectifying. She became aware that her hands were at her sides and that her fingernails were pressing into her palms, not hard enough to break skin, but hard enough to feel. She became aware of the specific way that humiliation moves through a body. Not like pain, which is sharp and announces itself, but like cold water rising, slow and total, until you are not sure if you are still breathing or if you simply forgot to notice when you stopped. She did not turn around. She walked through the terrace doors. The night outside was clear and empty and bitterly cold. The sky overhead a thick mess of stars that had no interest in the proceedings below. The terrace overlooked a courtyard 3 stories down, stone fountains that ran in warmer months now standing dry and pale in the dark. Seraphine walked to the balustrade and put both hands on the stone and stood there and let the cold come in. She had been here before. Not this terrace, not this specific courtyard, but this moment. The particular configuration of having trusted something that turned out to be smaller than you needed it to be. She had been here at 11 years old, watching her father's face when the letter came that ended his appointment. She had been here at 16 when she understood that her family's name would never fully recover and that she would spend her life learning to want things in proportion to what she could realistically have. She had been here repeatedly, in miniature, in all the small ways a woman in her position learned to recalibrate what she was allowed to expect. She was good at surviving this. The question, standing at the balustrade with the cold coming off the stone beneath her palms, was whether surviving it was the same as being alive. She stayed there long enough that the courtyard below stopped being a view and became just geometry. Her breathing leveled. She organized herself. There were practical considerations. She would need to leave without drawing attention to the leaving. She would need to make arrangements regarding the few obligations she had carried under Cassian's name. She would need to deal with the entirely predictable reality that Mira Holt would have distributed this story to anyone standing still within the hour. She was building the list when the noise from the hall changed. It did not get louder in the way that celebration gets louder. It shifted the way a crowd shifts when something has interrupted the structure of the room. A pull of attention, sudden and collective, like a tide taking a direction it had not been taking a moment before. Even out on the terrace, she could feel it. The quality of the air changed, the sound changed. And then, from inside the hall, she heard it. 2 iron doors. Not the entrance doors, not the doors she had come through, but the great double doors at the far end of the hall that she had always assumed were decorative because she had never once seen them opened. Those doors came apart. Not opened. Apart. The sound reached her through stone and glass like something subterranean, a deep compression, a concussive weight that was not exactly sound but that registered in the chest before the ears. The draft that followed it came through the terrace gap and hit her cold, reddened face and smelled like winter coming from somewhere north of winter, like altitude and iron and the particular cleanness of air that had never been breathed by anyone living at low elevation. She turned around. Through the glass panels beside the terrace doors, she could see the hall in partial cross-section, a slice of it, marble and candlelight, and people who had all stopped moving. The crowd had parted. She could see the gap forming, the instinctive, self-preserving separation of bodies when something enters a room that they do not know how to categorize. She could see, at the far edge of her viewing angle, the beginning of something moving through that gap. She pushed open the terrace door and stepped back inside. The air hit her differently. The room had changed temperature in the way rooms change temperature when the thing occupying the most space in them is not architecture but presence. The candles did not gutter. There was nothing so theatrical as candles responding to his entrance, but the quality of light seemed different, as if the room had recalculated what it was illuminating and adjusted. King Tharian Draven walked through the Hall of Veyrath like a man who had done the math on every other person in the room and found the total uninteresting. He was not what she had expected. She had seen portraits, the kind of official renderings commissioned for political reasons, in which rulers were made to look like the best architectural argument for their own authority. Strong jaw, noble brow, whatever combination of features the portraitist had decided said empire most efficiently. The paintings had given her a version of Tharian Draven that was impressive in the way monuments were impressive, which was to say, it communicated significance without communicating presence. The man walking through the hall was not a monument. He moved like something that had learned economy of motion through absolute necessity. No wasted gesture, no performance, not a single extra degree of articulation in any joint. He was taller than the men around him, but it was not the height that registered first. What registered first was the stillness in him, the quality of concentrated weight, the sense that he was not traversing the room so much as the room was rearranging itself around his path. His face was not the portrait face. It was harder than the portrait, worn rather than carved. The face of a man who had been cold and tired and correct in dangerous situations for a very long time and had stopped pretending any of it was something other than what it was. His eyes were gray, the kind of gray that had more colors in it than gray was supposed to contain. The gray of winter water, of old steel, of sky before a storm system arrives that does not intend to be brief. He was flanked by 2 men whose function was obviously protective, and who also, and this was the detail she absorbed with some removed part of her attention, were making no attempt to keep pace with him. They were keeping distance, a respectful foot behind each shoulder, and in that distance was the entire argument for what Tharian Draven was. You flanked someone who needed flanking. You maintained distance from something that was its own protection. The hall was silent except for the sound of music that had failed to stop yet and was now producing a series of increasingly hesitant notes as the musicians slowly understood the situation. The music stopped. Tharian Draven walked. He walked past Lord Fenric of the Southern Houses, who was one of the 3 most powerful men in the Empire by most counts, and who went entirely unacknowledged. He walked past General Hawthorne, who had won the siege of Karath and who received the same treatment. He walked past the cluster of royal heirs who watched him pass with the specific frozen attention of people who understood that they were not the event. He stopped. He stopped in front of Seraphine Voss. The silence in the room had been total for several seconds already, but the silence that occurred when he stopped was different in kind, not just degree. It was the silence of several hundred people simultaneously experiencing the same incomprehension and not being able to ask about it yet. He looked at her. She looked back at him because there was nothing else to look at and nowhere to put her eyes that made more sense. His expression was not readable in the way that most people's expressions were readable because it was not performing anything. He was not performing recognition, not performing significance, not performing the awareness that an entire court was watching him stand in front of a minor house lady near a terrace door with his boots still carrying the dust of whatever road he had ridden to get here tonight. He was simply looking at her, and the look had a weight to it that she felt in her sternum. He went to one knee. The sound that came from the room was not a gasp. It was more fundamental than that. The sound of several hundred people's internal models of the world failing to accommodate incoming information, manifesting as a collective arrest of breath. King Tharion Draven, the Alpha King of the Frost Empire, the man who had broken the Karath Rebellion with a winter campaign that had killed better men than most houses had ever produced, who had held the northern frontier for 11 years against 3 separate alliance coalitions and emerged from each campaign more intact than the alliances, who had never in the documented history of his reign bent anything lower than his will, was kneeling in front of her. "Seraphine Voss," he said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It had the quality that very few voices had, the quality where the room itself seemed to orient around it rather than away from it, where even the stone and the marble seemed to take it in. "I have been looking for you for 3 years," he said. She said nothing. She was not certain she was still breathing. The question of breathing seemed like a minor administrative matter compared to what was currently happening. "I know what tonight has cost you," he said. "I know what room I'm walking into, and I know what this night was before I arrived." He held her gaze, and something in it was absolutely steady, not gentle, not performing gentleness, just true in the way that iron is true, without apology for being heavier than other things. "I'm asking you to walk out of it with me." From somewhere to her left and behind her, she heard Cassian's voice. "Your Majesty." The voice had adjusted very quickly, very professionally, to the specific register of a man who was attempting to manage a situation that had arrived without warning. "I'm afraid there may be a misunderstanding. Lady Voss and I have a history that makes this—" "I know your name, Dorn." Tharion did not rise. He did not look toward Cassian. He remained as he was, on one knee, his gray eyes holding hers, and spoke Cassian's name the way you speak the name of a geographical feature, acknowledging it exists, assigning it no significance. "When I want your account of her, I will request it." The silence went another degree colder. Seraphine was aware that every single person in this hall was watching her. She was aware that the night had bent in a direction that had no map, and that whatever she said or did in the next 30 seconds would be the story that people told about this room for the rest of their lives. She was aware that the man kneeling in front of her was the most powerful individual in the known empire, and that she had no context for any of this, and that her palms were still cold from the terrace stone, and that the silver embroidery at her collar, which had felt like a child's mistake 20 minutes ago, was now just something she was wearing. She exhaled once. "You said 3 years," she said. Her voice came out leveled, which surprised her. "You've been looking for 3 years." "Yes." "You found me on the worst night of my life." Something moved through his expression that was not quite a smile but occupied some adjacent territory. "I didn't choose the timing," he said, "but I won't apologize for it either." "I'm not asking you to." She studied him. He let her study him, which was itself a piece of information. Most powerful men did not enjoy being studied. They enjoyed being received. "What I'm asking," she said, "is why." "Because you are my mate," he said. Simply, without decoration. "The way you say the sky is above us, which is not an opinion but a geography." From behind her, Cassian's voice again, sharper now, the professional register cracking at the edges. "That is, Your Majesty, I must advise some caution here. Lady Voss is—" Her family's position is not, she has no standing that would support a claim of this. Cassian. Therion rose then, not quickly, with a deliberate, unhurried extension of his body, the kind of motion that had the patience of something very large and very confident in its own proportions. He turned and looked at Cassian Dorn for what appeared to be the first time since he had entered the hall, and the look lasted approximately 2 seconds. You severed a mate bond tonight, in public, in front of the court, to replace her with a merchant guild connection. Cassian's jaw adjusted. That is a significant oversimplification of... I'm not oversimplifying. Therion's voice had not increased in volume. If anything, it had decreased, which was worse. I'm summarizing. There is a difference. The simplified version of you, he continued, is a man who calculated that she was worth less than a trade connection and acted accordingly. The full version of you is the same man with a longer explanation. The cluster of lords who had been standing near Cassian made the specific micro-adjustments of men who were slowly increasing the distance between themselves and a liability. Alara Vane had gone the color of the marble floor. Cassian's chin went up. She had seen him do this before. The defensive elevation, the physical signal that he was about to convert embarrassment into offense. The lady herself has expressed no interest in... The lady, Therion said, has been standing at a terrace door for 20 minutes because she walked away from a crowd that was watching her be discarded and preferred to be cold and alone rather than warm and humiliated. I know because I have been in this hall for longer than you realized. He paused. I was watching. The room absorbed this. Cassian's chin stayed up. His eyes moved to Seraphine. In them was something she recognized. Not remorse, not guilt, but the specific frustration of a man who had made a calculation that he still believed was correct and was now experiencing the consequences of external interference with that calculation. Seraphine, he said, and the use of her name without title was deliberate. A territorial marking. A reminder. You don't know this man. You have no idea what you would be walking into. Whatever he's told you, whatever he's offering, he hasn't offered me anything, she said. He kneeled in front of you in the middle of the hall, which is a political act. Yes. She looked at Cassian with a clarity that she hadn't been able to access 20 minutes ago on the terrace because 20 minutes ago she had been in the thick of it, and now she was somehow outside it, as if the whole night had crossed a threshold and she was standing on the other side of that line, looking back. Yes, it is. And you spent 3 years telling me that I was the only political act you were interested in. Cassian opened his mouth. Don't, she said. I'm done counting your explanations. She turned back to Therion. He was watching her with that gray steadiness that she still could not fully interpret, but that she recognized in some instinctive region below language as something real. You learned to read the difference, when you had grown up the way she had grown up, between the performance of regard and regard itself. Cassian had been good at the performance. Whatever Therion Draven was doing, it was not a performance. It was too expensive to be a performance. You did not walk into the Hall of Veyrath and kneel in front of a minor house lady as theater, because the price of that theater and political capital was too high for anyone to pay without a reason that mattered more than the cost. North, she said. It was not a question. Blackspire Citadel, he confirmed. The frontier. She had heard of it. Everyone had heard of it in the way that everyone had heard of winter in the Skyle Passes, as a thing that was real and extreme and belonged to a category of experience that was not quite compatible with the life she had been living. Cold, isolated, brutal. She had been told by people who had never been there and were therefore free to be dramatic about it. The king's seat. The Iron Throne of the North. When would we leave? She asked. Something shifted in the room again, a new recalibration because the question itself was its own answer. Tomorrow, he said. Before first light. She looked at the hall around her, the marble, the candles, the portraits of people she would never be, the cluster of lords who had been sliding away from Cassian like water finding a lower surface, Mira Holt, somewhere in the crowd, with a story that would now require extensive revision, Alara Vane, still the color of marble, the musicians frozen above their instruments. The Hall of Veyrath had been built to make people feel small. She had always understood this. She turned back to Therion. I'll need to send a letter to my household. Arrangements will be made. I'm not asking for your arrangements, she said. I'm telling you what I need before I leave. He held her gaze for a moment, and in it she thought she saw something move. A flicker of response that was not surprise exactly, but was adjacent to it, the response of someone who had expected accommodation and received precision instead. Then send it, he said. I'll wait. Cassian spoke behind her, and his voice had dropped the professional register entirely now, the edge underneath it exposed. You are making an enormous mistake. You have no idea what life in that fortress looks like. You have no idea what he is, what it costs to stand next to power like that. She did not turn around. I know what it costs to stand next to power like yours, she said. Let me try the other kind. The walk across the hall beside Therian Draven lasted approximately 45 seconds. It felt like something more significant than walking. The crowd did not close behind them. It did not settle back into its prior arrangements the way crowds sometimes did when the disruptive element had passed. It remained parted, the gap holding, as if the room itself had not yet decided what to do with the shape of what had just occurred inside it. At the great iron doors, Therian paused. He did not take her arm. He did not position himself ahead of her or behind her. He stopped at the doors and turned slightly and looked at her with the gray eyes that had no performance in them. I need you to know, he said, that I will not lie to you about what you're walking into. The Citadel is not the hall. The north is not the south. What's ahead of you is not comfortable or familiar, and I am not in the business of making it look like something other than what it is. Good, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Good, he said. They walked through the iron doors. The night outside the palace was absolute, the kind of darkness that the city produced at its edges, where the lanterns thinned and the stone took over, cold and indifferent and vast. The horses were already there, 3 of them, and a 4th bearing a rider she did not know. A woman in frontier leather, with the kind of weathered face that belonged to someone who had made her home in altitude and meant to keep it. The horses were not palace horses. They were heavy and northern and practical, without decoration, bred for endurance over elegance. Seraphine looked at them and thought about the gray dress with the silver embroidery at her collar. I'm going to need a coat, she said. One of the flanking men was already moving. She stood in the dark outside the Hall of Veyrath and felt the cold settle into her hair and her bare shoulders and thought about the list she had been building at the balustrade, the practical considerations, the arrangements, the recalibration of what was possible and what she was allowed to want. The list had been built for a different version of tonight. This version of tonight did not have a list yet. She thought about what Therian had said. I have been looking for you for 3 years. She thought about what that meant and did not mean, about the weight of a claim like that, about the fact that she had spent 3 years in the orbit of a man who had spent those same 3 years calculating her worth in trade terms and finding it insufficient. She thought about the particular architecture of that coincidence and found it too large to look at directly. The coat arrived. It was heavy and dark and smelled of horses and cold roads and the particular honest smell of things that were used without apology. She put it on. Therian watched her do this. He said nothing. She met his eyes over the collar of the coat. 3 years, she said again. 3 years. And you chose tonight. Tonight is when I found you, he said. I don't choose what I can't control. What can you control? She asked. His jaw set slightly. Not defensively, thoughtfully, with the careful quality of a man who had learned that answering certain questions too quickly was a form of lying. I can control, he said slowly, what happens after. She considered this. Somewhere behind them and above them, through the stone walls of the Hall of Veyrath, she could hear the crowd beginning to move again, the sounds of a room reassembling itself around the absence at its center, voices rising as the story was already being told and retold in the particular frantic way that stories got told when they had not yet settled into their final shape. Cassian would be talking. She knew how he talked. He would be explaining, contextualizing, positioning the night in whatever frame made him the most coherent version of himself. He was very good at that. He was, she thought, one of the most talented self-editors she had ever known. She thought about that and felt something release in her chest that she had not quite known was held. Not grief, or not grief only. Something more complex. The release of a version of the future she had been gripping with both hands while it quietly cut her. She looked at Therion. She looked at the coat she was wearing that belonged to no version of her life she had planned. She looked at the northern horses that were absolutely indifferent to everything that had just happened in the hall behind them. "Before first light," she said. "Yes." "Then I have a letter to send." She looked toward the palace servant who had materialized at the edge of the lantern light. "Pen and paper. Quickly, please." The servant moved. Therion said nothing. He had told her he would wait, and he was, standing in the cold with the patience of something that measured time in larger units than most people thought in. She wrote the letter standing up, using the side of a dispatch case one of the flanking men provided. She wrote to her household manager, to her cousin in the south, who would be alarmed by silence, to the single friend she had retained across 3 years of Cassian's social reshaping. She wrote quickly and without sentimentality, because there was not time for sentimentality, and because she had been trying sentimentality for 3 years and had the results in front of her. She handed the letters off. She looked up. And from within the palace behind her, through the iron doors that were still not quite fully closed, she heard it. Cassian's voice first, raised now beyond the professional register, something genuinely angry in it, and something that was also underneath the anger, afraid. And then another voice, older, higher, cold as the stone beneath their feet, and she recognized it as Lady Alara Vane's mother, who was one of the Merchant Guild's genuine interior powers, and who had apparently just understood that her daughter had walked into a situation that was going to be significantly more politically complex than initially presented. And then, cutting through both of them, cold and absolute, and carrying in the way that only true authority carried, a single sentence from Therion's second flanking guard, who had apparently been left behind for precisely this eventuality. "Any letter sent to Blackspire Citadel tonight," the guard said, "is a letter sent to the king. Govern yourselves accordingly." The silence that followed was the silence of people understanding something they did not want to understand. Seraphine looked at Therion. He was looking at her. "That was not planned," he said. "I know," she said, "but it was right." He held her gaze a moment longer. "Are you ready?" She looked at the palace behind her. The lanterns, the stone, the iron doors, the particular geometry of a place that had been built to make her feel small. She looked at the northern horses. She looked at the coat on her shoulders that smelled of real use. She thought about the hall and the column she had stood near, and the way Cassian's voice had sounded at 15 feet describing her as a mistake he had made when he had incomplete information. She thought about the silver embroidery at her collar and the way she had stood at the balustrade and chosen to survive rather than collapse. And whether those were even different things. She looked at Therion Draven, the Alpha King of the Frost Empire, who had 3 years and no explanation yet given, and an empire north of everything she knew, and gray eyes that held no performance, and had just kneeled in front of her in the most crowded room in the south. "Yes," she said. They mounted. The city fell behind them in stages. First the palace lanterns, then the merchant district torches, then the outer wall and the last stray lights of the settlements that clung to Veyrath's edge, like things that wanted proximity to power, without the cost of being inside it. The road north opened in front of them, pale and cold under the stars, and the wind that came down it smelled like altitude and distance, and the particular brutal cleanness of the frontier. Seraphine rode and did not look back. She was 2 hours north of the city, with the dark mountains beginning to define themselves against the starfield ahead, when she noticed it. She had not cried once. She had expected to. She had budgeted for it the way you budgeted for pain after injury. An acknowledgement that it was coming, and a practical attempt to accommodate it within the available time. She had been betrayed and humiliated and discarded in the most public venue available in the Empire, and she had expected to feel it fully once the immediate crisis was past and the distance was sufficient. She felt instead something she did not have immediate language for. Not numbness. Numbness was a quality of diminishment, of feeling losing resolution. This was different. Sharp and specific and present, like walking from a dim room into winter air and having every nerve in your face remind you that it was still working. She felt the cold. She felt the horse beneath her. She felt the coat on her shoulders and the particular quality of the road sound and the rhythm of movement, and the fact that the stars ahead were different stars than the stars behind because the mountains were in the way and the world had more than one direction in it. She felt, in a way that was uncomfortable and genuine and did not care whether it was convenient, alive. She looked at the road ahead. She looked at Therion, riding to her left with the same economy of motion he had brought to the hall, reading the road in the dark with the casual proficiency of someone who had done this specific thing in worse conditions and was not performing its ease. She thought about what she had not asked yet. She thought about 3 years and I have been looking, and the fact that she still did not know the shape of what she was riding toward, the actual texture of Blackspire Citadel, the political reality of what it meant to be named by a king in a hall and have that naming stick, the other forces in the Empire that would have opinions about tonight and would act on those opinions. She had been so focused on whether to go that she had not yet fully reckoned with the fact that she was going. The mountains grew. The wind was relentless and coming from a direction that suggested they were riding into it rather than with it, which was going to be true for a while yet. And then, from somewhere ahead, from the direction of the first mountain pass, in the dark that was darker than the open road dark, she saw it. A light, small and cold and blue-white, moving. Then more lights. 4, 6, 10 riders coming down toward them from the pass with the specific controlled haste of people who were not fleeing something but responding to something, covering ground with the purpose of people who had been waiting to move and had just received permission. Therion had seen them. Of course he had. He was already steady, already absorbing what they were, and his 2 flanking guards were pulling slightly forward with the reflexive realignment of people who were assessing threat by profession. Who are they? Seraphine asked. Therion's jaw was set again, the thoughtful quality, not the defensive one. Border riders, he said. Mine. But they were not supposed to be this far south. Meaning? Meaning, he said, and something in his voice went a degree quieter than it had been. That they were sent south by someone who knew I was coming to Veyrath tonight. The riders were coming fast now. The blue-white lights were torches, ice oil, she realized, the frontier-burning compound that held in cold and wet where standard torch oil failed. She could see the riders' shapes, heavy coats, crossbows at the saddle. Therion raised his right hand. The lead rider came to a stop 20 feet ahead, horse stamping in the cold road, breath coming out in twin columns of steam. My king. The rider's voice was young and tight, and carrying something that was not calm. There is a message from the Citadel. Speak! The rider reached into a coat and produced a sealed document and held it at arm's length like it was something he was glad to have passed out of his hands. Therion took it. He did not open it immediately. He looked at it for a moment in the torchlight. At the seal, at whatever the seal communicated to someone who knew how to read seals at distance in bad light. And his expression did something she had not seen it do yet. It went still. Not calm still, the way it had been in the hall. Still in the way water went still before it stopped being water and became something it was not supposed to be at this time of year. He looked up from the document. His eyes found her face in the torchlight, and he held them there for a moment that was longer than it needed to be if nothing was wrong. What is it? She said. He opened the document. He read it once, and then he read it again, and in the second reading she could see the translation happening. The way a man with many contingencies sorted through which one still applied to a situation that had just changed shape. He folded the document. He looked at the road ahead. He looked at the mountains with their distance and their dark and their absolute indifference to the complication below. Then he looked at her. The northern clans, he said, have declared that they will not receive a queen from the south. The torchlight moved in the wind. They've declared, he continued, that if I bring you to Blackspire Citadel, they will withdraw their allegiance from the crown, all 6 clans, simultaneously. The cold was very present. And if they withdraw, Seraphine said slowly, the frontier falls, he said, within a season. She looked at him. He looked at her. The road north stretched ahead of them, pale and cold, into the dark between mountains, toward a fortress that had already decided it did not want her before she arrived. The riders waited with their ice oil torches burning blue in the wind. And Therion Draven, the Alpha King of the Frost Empire, the man who had broken 3 coalitions and buried 2 rebellions and held the frontier for 11 years, was looking at her with gray eyes that had no performance in them and waiting for the same thing she was waiting for. Whatever came next. The torches burned blue in the wind and nobody spoke. Seraphine sat her horse and felt the cold coming through the coat and looked at the sealed document in Therion's hand and understood that she was the problem in the equation. Not the clans, not the politics, not the 11 years of frontier architecture that this moment was threatening to dismantle. She was the variable that did not belong. She had known this in the hall when she decided to leave. She had known it when she mounted. She had simply chosen not to let knowing it be the thing that stopped her. She was reconsidering the wisdom of that now. "How long have they known?" she asked. Therion folded the document once, twice, tucking it into his coat with the economy of someone filing information rather than reacting to it. "Long enough to coordinate," he said. "All 6 clans don't move together quickly. This was organized before tonight, before you came to the hall." "Yes." She absorbed that. "So they knew you were going." "They suspected." His jaw moved slightly. "I told no one. But the northern clans have runners that move faster than most people believe, and I have been looking for 3 years, as I said. The pattern would have been visible to someone paying attention. And they paid attention. They always pay attention. That is how they have survived everything the South has sent at them for 4 generations." He said it without condemnation, a man who respected the quality even when it was currently deployed against him. "They knew I would find you eventually. They prepared for it." The young rider on the lead horse shifted his weight. His horse stamped. He was watching the exchange with the careful attention of someone who understood that the conversation he was hearing was well above his rank, but that the outcome was going to affect everyone below it. Seraphine looked at the mountains. 6 clans. Simultaneously. Before she had arrived, before she had set foot in a single foot of frontier territory, before she had done anything or failed at anything or proven herself insufficient in any of the specific ways she had already begun cataloging against herself. She had been judged, deliberated upon, and rejected by people who had never been in the same room with her. She tried to locate the feeling that produced in her and found it was not the feeling she expected. She expected the old familiar shape of being assessed and found wanting, the minor house experience, the shadow she had been standing in for 31 years. This was different. This was not dismissal. This was opposition, which was a different category entirely. Dismissal said you don't matter enough to engage. Opposition said you matter enough to block. She had never been blocked before. She had only ever been overlooked. "What happens?" she said. "If you bring me to the Citadel, anyway." Therion looked at her steadily. "The clans pull their garrison contributions. 2,000 border riders. They stop maintaining the Skyle passes through winter, which means the trade routes close, which means the Citadel supply lines reduce by 40% by mid-season. The frontier holds on my soldiers alone, which it can do, for a time." He paused. "A finite time." "How finite?" "1 hard winter, maybe 2. Something moved behind his eyes. "The 3rd one breaks us." She held his gaze. He had not softened any of it. He had not framed it as something navigable or manageable or as a problem that had a ready solution somewhere in the middle distance. He had looked at her in the torchlight and given her the actual numbers, which was either respect or practicality, and she was not yet certain which. "What are you asking me?" she said. "I'm not asking you anything," he said. "Not yet. I'm telling you what it is." She looked at the young rider, who was looking at a point slightly to the left of Therion's shoulder with the professional focus of a man who had decided he was furniture. She looked at the 2 flanking guards, who were doing the same. She looked at the woman in frontier leather, who was the only person in the group who was looking directly at her, with an expression that was assessment rather than hostility. The look of someone taking measurements they had not expected to need. "What do the clans want?" Seraphine asked. "Officially," Therion said, "they want a queen with a northern bloodline, a name they know, an alliance that benefits them." His voice was level, factual, without editorial. They want someone who was already part of the structure before tonight. And unofficially, his expression shifted a fraction. They want to know if they can break it. Break what? This. He did not gesture between them. He did not need to. The word "this" carried its own weight, an acknowledgement of something that had no name yet in either of their vocabularies. They have been testing me for 11 years, what I will bend and what I won't, where my lines are, how much I can be pressured before I recalculate. He paused. They want to know if you are the thing that moves me. She understood what he was not saying. If she turned back, the clans would learn the answer was yes. The thing that moves the king is the threat of the thing he wants. Apply it. Watch it work. They would use that information forever because that was what the clans were built on. Practical knowledge about where the power actually sat and how to reach it. If she rode forward, the frontier entered a window of genuine vulnerability, and the cost of that vulnerability would be paid by people who had no vote in the matter and no particular stake in whether Seraphine Voss wore a crown or went back to standing near columns and halls. She breathed in. The air tasted like altitude coming, the specific mineral quality that high country air had before you arrived in it. Where are the clan leaders now? She asked. Therion looked at her with a slight shift in his attention, the way someone looked when a conversation had taken a direction they were mapping in real time. 3 days' ride from the Citadel. Waiting. Waiting for word. Yes. So they don't know yet whether you turned back. They will know shortly, he said. The passes have watchers. She sat with that for a moment. The torches moved in the wind. The horses breathed. Ride, she said. Therion was still. Ride north, she said. Don't stop. Don't send word. Don't give them anything to interpret yet. The longer they don't know, the less comfortable they are, and uncomfortable people make premature decisions. She looked at him directly. Do you have riders who can reach the Citadel ahead of us? He studied her for a long moment. In it, she felt the assessment happening, the same kind of measurement the frontier woman had been making, but more direct, more searching, with the specific quality of a man who had been making high-stakes decisions for a long time and was recalibrating where the relevant information was coming from. I have riders who can reach the Citadel in half the time we can, he said. Send them. Not with a message. Send them without a message. Send them riding fast and visible through whatever passes the clan watcher's monitor. She felt the shape of it solidifying in her head the way ideas solidified when they were actually sound, not with the feeling of brilliance, but with the quieter, more durable feeling of this is how it actually works. Let the watchers see the riders. Let them decide what the riders mean. They will spend the next 2 days arguing about it. Nobody spoke. The young rider had abandoned the pretense of looking at Therion's shoulder and was staring at her openly. The frontier woman's mouth had shifted slightly at one corner, not a smile, an adjustment. Therion looked at her for a moment longer. That buys time, he said, not resolution. Time is what I need, she said. I can't resolve anything I haven't seen yet. Take me north and let me see it. The silence between them had a different quality than the silence after the hall doors. That silence had been the room holding its breath. This one was something more like recognition. The specific beat between two people when they understand for the first time that the other one is not what they expected and that the revision is going to matter. Therion turned to the young rider. Take 3 others. Ride the Halen Pass route. Fast and visible. Don't stop at the garrison waypoints. Pass straight through. The rider straightened. Message to the Citadel, my king? None. The rider absorbed this and, to his credit, absorbed it without visible confusion, which told Seraphine something about the quality of the men Therion kept around him. He turned his horse and split off with 3 others, the blue torches moving into the dark at a pace that would be visible from the ridge watchers by dawn. Therion looked at her. She held his gaze and did not fill the silence because it did not need filling. North, he said. They rode. The road climbed within the first hour, gentle at first, and then with the unsubtle insistence of terrain that had decided to be serious about altitude. The cold deepened in the particular way that mountain cold deepened, not by degree but by character, turning from the ambient chill of a winter night into something with texture and intent. Her breath started producing steam. The horse beneath her moved differently, adjusting its gait to road surface that was patchy with thin ice, where the rock faces above had wept and frozen. She did not speak. Therion did not speak. The frontier woman, whose name she had not yet learned, rode slightly behind and to her right, and the sound of her horse was the sound of competence, economical and unhurried, and completely without the compensatory noise that uncertain riders made. At some point in the second hour, the last southern settlement light disappeared behind a ridgeline, and the dark became total, broken only by the cold brightness of stars that were thicker and closer at this elevation, and by the lanterns the two remaining guards carried. The landscape was not visible so much as implied. The mass of rock above, the fall of the ground below the road's edge, the sense of scale that came from sound and wind, and the particular silence of terrain that had been indifferent to humans for longer than humans had been passing through it. She became aware of the dress, the gray dress with the silver embroidery that she had put on for a haul that was 11 hours in a world behind her. Beneath the heavy frontier coat, it was warm enough, but at the ankles it was not. And at the places where the coat did not meet the saddle, it was not. And the silver embroidery at the collar was absorbing cold at the decorative openwork in a way that was going to be genuinely unpleasant by the third hour. She did not mention this. She adjusted her grip on the reins, redistributed her weight slightly, and thought about the clan leaders 3 days from the citadel and the things she did not know yet that she needed to know. Their names, their history, their specific grievances, the texture of their opposition. Whether it was principled or tactical or personal or some combination that required a different approach for each element. "The woman behind me," she said. Therion glanced across. "Maret. She's frontier. Born in the Skyel Passes, rides border patrol when she isn't traveling with me." His voice had the quality of information rather than introduction, which suited her fine. She half turned in the saddle. "Maret." The frontier woman looked at her without expression. "The 6 clan leaders," Seraphine said. "I need to know them before we reach the citadel. Not the political version, the actual version." Maret's eyes moved to Therion briefly, a reflex, and then she corrected it and looked back at Seraphine. "That's a long conversation. We have 3 days." Maret considered this with the deliberate quality of someone who was deciding whether to adjust a category. "Clan Skyer," she said finally. "Eldest. Their leader is a woman named Haldra, 70 years old. She has buried 3 of her own children to the frontier wars and does not trust anything that has not already cost her something. What does she respect?" "Endurance," Maret said. "Not strength. She's seen enough strength. She's interested in who's still standing when strength has already failed." Seraphine held that. "Next." "Clan Vorn. Their man is Dael, 40, maybe 45. His grudge is specific. He believes the Southern Crown has taken tribute from the frontier clans for 3 generations and invested nothing in return. He's not wrong. A beat. He's also using that grievance as a shield for personal ambition, which is a combination that makes him harder to deal with than a man with only one motive." "Is he the one who organized tonight?" Maret looked at her straight for the first time with something that might have been respect and might have been recalibration. "Likely," she said. "He has the patience for it." Seraphine nodded. "Go on." And Maret went on, and the road climbed, and the dark deepened, and Seraphine listened and built the map she needed because she had learned at 11 years old that the only thing that was reliably available to someone with her history and her resources was the understanding of a room before she entered it. She had applied that to halls and dinner tables and social arrangements. Now she applied it to clans and passes and an empire's frontier, and the mechanism was the same even if the stakes had grown past anything she had previously operated inside of. She was still listening when the road leveled onto a ridge and the wind arrived from the north without obstruction and hit her full in the face. It was a different wind than the city wind. It had no borrowed warmth in it, no smell of fires and people and proximity. It was completely itself, come from elevation and distance, carrying the smell of snow that had not yet fallen and stone that had not been warm since summer. It hit her, and she did not flinch from it, and she did not close her eyes. She breathed it in. Something in her chest that had been pulled tight since the terrace loosened another fraction. Therion had not been watching her. She knew this because he was a man who looked at the road rather than the people beside him. But she felt the shift in his attention, a quality of stillness to his left that had not been there a moment before, and she understood without looking directly that he had noticed. She did not address it. She did not need to yet. They camped 3 hours before dawn at a way station cut into the rock face, a frontier building, thick-walled and functional, with a fire pit that the guards had running within minutes of arrival and a supply cache that contained dried provisions and fuel and nothing that was not useful. There was no bed. There was a flat surface with a frontier roll that someone had laid out, and Seraphine looked at it and thought about the last bed she had slept in, and then stopped thinking about it and sat down and ate what was handed to her without comment. The fire made the room comprehensible. The guard settled into the efficient quiet of people who knew how to rest without wasting the opportunity for it. Marit was already asleep against the far wall, with the complete practicality of someone who had learned to take unconsciousness when it was available. Therian sat across the fire. He had not slept. She did not think he was planning to. She looked at him through the fire, and he looked back at her. And the fire made his face different. The shadows moved, and the gray in his eyes picked up the orange, and the angles of his face that were hard in daylight were harder in this light and more honest, the way firelight was always honest because it could not be arranged. "You're not going to tell me to sleep," she said. "I wasn't planning to." "Good." She folded her hands around the canteen they had given her, warming them. "What was Blackspire before the frontier wars?" He looked at her. An outpost, supply depot, 200 people, mostly soldiers. And now, 4,000. Military, administrative, the families they brought, some craftspeople, medics. His voice had the quality of a man reciting something he knew the way you knew your own heartbeat, constantly, without having to think about it. The clans contribute another 800 riders during their patrol seasons. And the 800 leave if I arrive. Yes. She turned the canteen in her hands. What did the last Queen of the North look like? In the clan's history? Not officially. He was quiet for a moment, not reluctant, searching, finding the right level of precision. "There was no Queen of the North," he said. "There has been no Empress at the Citadel in the frontier's current configuration. My predecessors ruled from the south. You moved north." "Yes." "Why?" The fire moved. A log shifted and sent a brief column of sparks upward, and the shadows rebuilt themselves. "Because," he said, "you cannot hold territory you are not willing to live in." He said it simply, without philosophy, the way you said water flows down, not as an insight, but as an observation about the nature of things. My predecessors held the frontier with garrison commanders. The garrison commanders made deals that benefited garrison commanders. The clans learned to manage through the commander layer, rather than the crown. By the time I inherited it, the frontier's loyalty was to 12 different garrison interests and approximately 0% to the throne. And you went north to cut out the middle. "I went north," he said, "because someone had to." She looked at him. The quality of that sentence was not heroic. It did not have the sound of a man who had assessed the options and chosen the noble one. It had the sound of a man who had looked at the available landscape and done the math and reached a conclusion that other people had declined to reach and stepped into the vacancy because the vacancy was dangerous and he was the person in the room most equipped to survive it. She recognized that quality. She had grown up in proximity to it, watching her father do it in smaller arenas, watching herself do it at tables and in halls, the specific reflex of someone who had learned to step into the gap, not because they wanted the gap, but because the gap was there, and it mattered. 3 years? She said again. Yes. You were in the South 3 years ago. Periodically. Political business, trade negotiations. He held her eyes through the fire. I saw you at a winter convening. You were arguing with a trade minister about agricultural tariff calculations, and you were correct, and he knew you were correct, and he was going to rule against you anyway, because you were a minor house daughter with no institutional backing. She remembered it. The tariff convening. She had been 28 and had done 3 months of calculation and presented it clearly, and the minister had smiled at her with the specific smile that meant you are technically right and functionally irrelevant, and overruled her. I don't remember seeing you, she said. You weren't looking for me. What did you see? She was not asking for flattery. She was asking for data. He was quiet for long enough that she knew it was not because he didn't know the answer. I saw someone who was right in a room that had decided rightness was not the currency in use, he said. And you didn't fold. You didn't perform anger or wound. You just looked at him like he had confirmed something you had been half expecting, and then you put your papers away and you left with more composure than anyone in that room deserved from you. She looked at the fire. And then, he said, the noise in my head went quiet. The fire. The breathing of sleeping guards. The wind outside finding the joins in the stone. She had heard him say it in the hall. The noise stopped, and she had filed it as a claim, a piece of data she did not yet have context for. Now, in the way station in the dark with the frontier cold pressing on the walls, it landed differently. She could see it in him, the weight of it. The way he held himself with the particular tension of someone who was managing something very heavy and had been doing so for so long that the management had become structural, had built itself into the posture and the economy of movement and the quality of silence he produced around himself. How often is it quiet now, she said. When I'm near you. Simply. Without decoration. Not completely, not the way it was in the first moment, 3 years ago, but quieter than it is otherwise. She held that. That's a considerable amount of weight to lay on a person, she said. Yes. I'm not telling you not to lay it. I'm telling you I see it. His eyes, through the fire, were steady and without performance and carrying something that she recognized as the specific relief of a man who had said a true and difficult thing and been heard without the hearing collapsing into pity or strategy. Sleep, he said. A few hours. The road after the first pass is harder. She did not argue. She lay down on the frontier roll and the fire made the ceiling move, and she thought about Haldra of Clan Skyer, who respected endurance, who had buried 3 children to the wars, who was not going to be moved by a title or an argument or a king's claim. She thought about Dael of Clan Vorn and his layered motives and his patience and the specific danger of a man who was both principled and ambitious and knew how to use one to justify the other. She thought about arriving at Blackspire Citadel with 4,000 people who had not asked for a queen and 6 clan leaders who had already voted no. She thought about the dress with the silver embroidery still under the coat. She thought about the wind on the ridge and the way her lungs had opened in it. She slept. She woke to gray light and the sound of Moray breaking down the supply cache with the brisk efficiency of someone who considered sleeping past the light a personal failing. The fire was low. Therion was already outside. She could hear his voice in the flat, clipped register of a man conducting a morning debrief with his guards. She sat up. Her neck ached from the surface, and there was a stiffness in her left knee that was new, and the cold had climbed in overnight past the fire's range, and her ankles were genuinely unhappy. She acknowledged all of this and stood up without assistance because there was no assistance available, and also because she had a sense, forming like weather, that how she handled the small indignities of this road was going to matter in ways she could not entirely predict. Marek glanced at her without comment and handed her a portion of dried provisions and a canteen of water that was just above freezing. Seraphine ate it standing. "How far to the first pass?" she asked. 6 hours, Maret said, weather holds. "And if it doesn't hold?" Maret looked at the ceiling in the way that frontier people looked at ceilings when they were translating external conditions into information. "Longer." Seraphine nodded. She adjusted the coat. She thought about the clan leaders in their camp 3 days north of the citadel, and the riders that Therion had sent last night without a message. And she thought about what the watchers on the ridges would report this morning, and what Dael of Clan Vorn would do with ambiguous information. She thought about the answer she had given Therion on the road. "Take me north and let me see it." And she thought about whether that answer had been courage or stubbornness, and concluded that the distinction was probably less important than the road ahead. She walked out into the gray morning. Therion was standing at the road's edge with his guards, looking north. The mountains were visible now that the dark was gone. Enormous and without apology, white above the tree line, defined by angles that had nothing polite in them. The road disappeared into their base, and somewhere inside them was the first pass, and on the other side of that pass was the frontier proper, and on the far side of the frontier proper was Blackspire Citadel. He heard her and turned. She looked at the mountains. The clan leaders, she said. Send them a message. His expression shifted slightly. What message? Tell them I'm coming. She held the northern skyline in her eyes and felt the wind moving cold and direct and completely without interest in her preferences. Not the king's mate. Not the woman from the hall. Tell them Lady Seraphine Voss is riding the Skyle Pass in winter without a caravan and without complaint. Tell them I want to meet them when I arrive. Not after the ceremony, not in a formal setting, at the gate. She looked at him. Before I go in. Therion was very still. You want to meet 6 clan leaders who have declared opposition before you've even entered the citadel. I want them to look at me before they've committed completely, she said. Right now their no is theoretical. They decided it in a camp 3 days away about someone they have never seen. Let them look at me. Let the no be about me specifically instead of about the idea of me. She held his gaze. If it's still no after that, at least it's honest. He looked at her for a long moment. The guards were watching with the furniture politeness they had displayed on the road, which she was beginning to understand was not furniture at all, but a specific kind of attention, the attention of people who were calibrating something in real time and not advertising that they were doing it. And if it's still no after that, Therion said carefully, you would have handed them a face-to-face rejection to use politically. Yes, she said. I would also have stood in front of them in a frontier pass in winter, wearing a coat that isn't mine over a dress I wore to a dinner party, having ridden 3 days from a hall where I was publicly humiliated, and I will have done it without anyone carrying me. She looked at the mountains. Let them make their no about that. Let them explain to the rest of the frontier why they looked at that and said, not enough. Nobody spoke. The wind came from the north and moved through the space between them and kept going south and did not look back. Therion turned to his senior guard. Send the message. The guard moved. Seraphine looked at the road, at the mountains above it, at the pass that was 6 hours away in good weather and longer in bad. She thought about Haldra, 70 years old, who had buried 3 children and respected endurance above everything. She thought about what endurance looked like from the outside. Not stoic, not composed, not the careful arrangement of a face over a wound. Real endurance. The kind that could not be faked because it was not performed. The kind that accumulated in the body over distance and weather and difficulty and was visible in the posture of someone who had been uncomfortable for a long time and was still moving. She was going to look exactly like that by the time she reached that gate. She was not sure, looking at the mountains ahead of her, whether she was afraid of what was waiting at the end of the road, or whether the fear had been replaced by something harder and quieter and considerably more useful. She put her boot in the stirrup. She mounted. And somewhere behind her and above her, on a ridge she could not see in the morning gray, a watcher who served Clan Vorn looked down at the small group on the road and counted the riders and noted the absence of a proper caravan and watched the woman in the oversized coat settle into her saddle and turn her face north without hesitation, and began to run. The watcher on the ridge ran, and the world did not wait for Seraphine to be ready for what he was running toward. The first pass took 7 hours instead of 6. The weather did not break into a storm. It did something more insidious than that, producing a low ceiling of cloud that turned the light flat and gray and robbed the road of its depth, so that every step the horses took landed on surface that could not be read until it was already beneath you. Ice where there appeared to be gravel, loose stone where there appeared to be firm ground. The horses felt it before their riders did, and adjusted with the careful, unhurried distrust of animals that understood the road was lying to them. Seraphine rode without complaint because complaint would not improve the road, and because Marais was ahead of her moving with the economical assurance of someone who had ridden this pass in worse conditions and regarded it as a known quantity rather than a threat. And Seraphine had decided somewhere in the second hour that Marais's relationship with the terrain was information she was going to use. She watched how Marais's body moved, how her weight distributed when the ground shifted, how she read the road surface through her horse's response before her eyes confirmed it. She adjusted. Her knee ached and her ankles were passed unhappy into something more definitive, and the dress under the coat was doing nothing useful below the knee, and the cold had found the silver embroidery at her collar and was doing specific, detailed work on it. She did not mention any of this. She watched the road, and she thought about Dael of Clan Vorn and the watcher on the ridge above the way station, and the message that was riding north ahead of them through channels she could not see. They came through the pass in the early afternoon into a valley that was wider than anything on the southern side and emptier. The kind of empty that was not absence but presence. The active, enormous presence of landscape that had not been organized by human effort and did not intend to be. The mountains were on three sides and higher than the pass mountains. Their peaks disappeared into the flat gray ceiling. The valley floor was pale with frost-killed grass and threaded by a river that was dark and fast and would be ice by deep winter. It looked like the beginning of something, or the end. She was not certain yet which. 3 more days to the citadel, Moret said, riding beside her now that the road had width enough for 2. Through valley? Mostly. 1 more high section tomorrow, then it descends. Seraphine looked north. The clan camp? Off the main road. Tributary valley, east branch. Moret's voice was neutral in the way that frontier voices were frequently neutral. Not concealing anything, just not performing. You'll see their smoke before you see their tents. Will they come to the gate when I message? Moret was quiet for a moment that was professional rather than reluctant. Haldra will, she said. She respects the gesture, even if she intends to refuse what it represents. Dael? A pause. Dael will come because he does not want anyone to see what they do at that gate without him there to shape the interpretation afterward. And the other 4? Where Haldra and Dael go, the others read the situation and follow the stronger signal. Seraphine filed this. Which of them is stronger, between Haldra and Dael? Haldra is older, the clan's weight age. Moret's eyes were on the road ahead. But Dael organized tonight. The others know it. That has its own weight. A beat. If they stand at the gate together, it means they have already agreed on their position. If they arrive separately, there is still daylight between them. What do you think they'll do? Moret looked at her sideways with the specific look of a frontier woman being asked for a personal opinion by someone she had not yet classified. I think, she said carefully, that they did not expect the message you sent. I think they were prepared for arrival by caravan with ceremony and political apparatus. And what they are getting is a woman who rode the Skyle Pass in winter with 6 riders and sent them a message asking to meet at the gate. She looked back at the road. I think you have confused them. Confused people are still dangerous, but they are dangerous in a less organized way. Seraphine looked at the valley, at the river and the frost grass and the enormous, indifferent mountains. Good, she said. They camped that night at a garrison waypoint that was more substantial than the previous one. A frontier post with 4 permanent soldiers who were clearly in the habit of seeing the king's rider come through, and who adjusted to seeing the king himself with the professional composure of men who had been trained to absorb surprises and continue functioning. They fed the horses and provided hot food, and did not ask questions. Therian took her aside while the guards settled in. He had been quieter since the morning. Not withdrawn. She had learned within a day that his quiet was not the same as absence, that it was more like compression, a quality of containment that intensified rather than diminished the attention underneath it. But there was something in the quality of his quiet tonight that was different from the road quiet. Something in the set of his jaw and the way his eyes moved when he thought no one was tracking them. What is it? She said. He did not deflect. She was noting this about him, the absence of the social reflex to manage what he was showing before he decided to show it. He just looked at her. My senior guard rode ahead to the citadel this afternoon. I received a message back an hour ago. And? The message I sent ahead last night, he said. The riders with no message, through the visible pass route. He stopped. Tell me. Someone at the citadel knew I had sent them, he said. Before they arrived, someone sent word to Clan Vorn's secondary camp east of the citadel that the riders carried no message and that the king was traveling with 1 woman and 6 guards. The fire in the garrison post was at her back, and it was warm enough that the cold beyond the doorframe was visible as a quality of the dark rather than something she felt on her skin, and she stood there and heard what he had said and took the full shape of it into her understanding before she responded. Someone inside your operation, she said. Yes. Who knew about the riders? 3 people, he said. Myself, Moret, and my senior guard, Rael. She held his eyes. Rael is the one who just rode to the citadel. Yes, she breathed. Therian's face in the firelight was doing nothing she could interpret easily. It was not performing any of the things that faces performed when they received news of betrayal. Not the theatrical disbelief, not the visible wound, not the anger that was really grief operating under a different name. It was simply holding itself together over something that was very heavy, the way old stone held itself over foundations that had shifted not by adding material, but by being dense enough to bear it. How long has Rael been with you? She asked. 11 years? His voice was level. The levelness was the thing, she thought, the thing that told you more than any other voice quality would have. A man who was performing composure raised his voice and then corrected it. A man who had spent 11 years in situations that required actual composure did not need to perform it. He simply produced it, even when it was costing him something specific and serious. He came north with me. He was at the siege of Karath. He has ridden more frontier road than most men alive. And now he's at the citadel. Therian confirmed. And the clan leaders know exactly how small my traveling party is, and that I am not arriving with political reinforcement, and that the woman I am bringing has no caravan and no institutional backing, and that I sent riders ahead as a misdirection rather than a show of force. She absorbed the full damage of this. Every tactical choice she had made on the road, the no-message riders, the gate meeting request, the deliberate informality of their approach, all of it had been information. All of it had traveled to Dale of Clan Vorn before it could function as strategy. He didn't just tell them about the riders, she said. Therian looked at her steadily. He told them everything, she said, from the way station. He was there when I laid out the approach. He was furniture while I talked to Mairead about the clan leaders. The specific cold quality of it settled through her, not shock, but the thing that came after shock had finished. Clarity, unpleasant and complete. He heard me build the entire approach and sent it ahead before we broke camp. That is my assessment as well, Therian said. Why? She asked it not because she needed the emotional accounting, but because understanding the motive was structural. Motive told you who else was involved and how deep the arrangement ran and whether Rael was the source or a conduit. I don't know yet. Something moved in Therian's face for the first time. Not the performance of feeling, but the actual thing, surfacing briefly and then going back under the discipline that held it. 11 years is a long time to be a man who holds someone else's weight. Long enough to build resentments. Long enough to be approached by someone who offered him something I did not. He stopped. Long enough to decide that the arrival of a southern woman was the thing he would not follow me into. She looked at the fire, at the garrison walls, at the maps she had been building in her head over 2 days of riding, all of which had just been handed to the opposition. Dael of Clan Vorn now knew she was coming with 6 riders, no ceremony, a strategy built on deliberate informality, and a request to meet at the gate. He knew she had identified him as the organizer. He knew she understood the Haldra-Dael dynamic. He had everything she had said on the road at night when she had believed she was building advantage. She had handed him a complete picture of her hand. What does Rael expect you to do when you arrive at the Citadel? She asked. I imagine he expects me to pursue him, Therian said. Detain him, make the betrayal visible, turn my attention to managing the internal fracture. While the clan leaders watched the king handle a traitor instead of arriving with authority. Yes. She looked at him. Are you going to pursue him? The question landed in the space between them, and the fire moved. I want to, Therian said, with a flatness in his voice that was more honest than any performance of calm would have been. 11 years, Karath. The second winter campaign when we were down to 30 men, and he stayed. He stopped. The muscle in his jaw moved once. I want to ride through that gate and take him apart piece by piece in front of everyone who serves under him. But that is exactly what Dael needs me to do. The want and the calculation were both visible in him simultaneously, which was its own kind of rare. Most men hid one or expressed the other. He was holding both in the open, which meant he trusted her with the actual content of the moment rather than the managed version of it. If I arrive furious and internal and focused on the fracture inside my own house, the clans see a king who cannot hold his own men, a king who was surprised, a king who came north with a woman who disrupted his operation before she even arrived. And if you do nothing, if I do nothing, Rael continues to function with information access and Dial continues to receive it. He looked at her. There is no version of this that is comfortable. She held his gaze. The fire made the room orange and close, and the cold outside was absolute, and the road to the citadel was 2 more days north, and somewhere at the end of it, a man who had ridden at this king's shoulder for 11 years was sitting with her strategy in his hands, and Dial of Clan Vorn was deciding what to do with it. She had been in this shape before. Not this specific configuration of forces, not empires and frontier clans and king's guards who had turned, but the shape itself. The shape of having your approach anticipated and neutralized before you could deploy it. Of arriving in a room where someone had already done the work of making you look exactly as small as they needed you to be. The minor house shape. The shape she had lived inside for 31 years. She had never beaten it by doing what it expected. Don't pursue Rael, she said. Therian was still. Leave him exactly where he is, she said. Let him believe you haven't connected the disclosure to him yet. Give him another day of access. She held Therian's eyes and felt the clarity of it, hard and cold, and without any comfort in it. Then send him something false. The silence was absolute. Send him information that I want Dial to have, she said. Something that will make Dial change his position at the gate. Something that shifts the ground under a plan he is already committed to. She breathed. Let Rael carry it. Let Dial receive it and act on it. And when Dial acts on something that I gave him, when he moves based on false information that I controlled, then we will know the exact shape of his strategy, and Rael will have demonstrated his function to everyone at the Citadel who is watching. Therian looked at her for a long time. The fire settled, a log shifted. The garrison soldiers outside were quiet in the way that people were quiet when they were professionally not listening. What do you want to send him? Therian said finally. I want him to believe, she said slowly, working it out as she spoke, that I am going to ask for a formal council meeting before the gate meeting, that I have changed the approach and want a table and a formal setting and witnesses, that I am more afraid of the informality than I initially presented. She held the shape of it in her mind. Let him prepare for a formal council. Let him arrange his arguments for a structured political environment. Let him tell the other clan leaders to expect a hall and a table. She looked at Therian, and then I will meet them at the gate, in the cold, in the coat, in the dress that is 3 days old and has crossed the scale pass in it. Therian was quiet. He was doing the calculation. She could see it happening, not slowly, the way uncertain men calculated, but quickly and without visible machinery, the way men who had been in dangerous situations long enough to do the math at the speed the situation required. Dael will be prepared for the wrong confrontation, he said. Yes. And when he is caught in the wrong configuration, the other 4 leaders will see it. They will see that he prepared incorrectly, that he organized this opposition on the basis of intelligence that turned out to be managed. His jaw set. It will not end the opposition, but it will fracture the confidence they have in his information, which is the only confidence that matters right now, she said, because it's the only thing holding all 6 of them together. He looked at her. Outside, the wind moved through the garrison post's eaves and made a sound like something pressing from outside to get in, and Seraphine stood in the firelight in the coat that was not hers and thought about Rael and 11 years and the specific weight of carrying someone you had trusted completely through a winter campaign with 30 men, and she thought about Cassian and 3 years, and the note that had said, "Meet me there," and the way his voice sounded at 15 feet, describing her as incomplete information. She thought about what you had left when the people you had believed in revealed themselves to be something other than what you thought you were holding. You had what was left after that. You had what could not be taken by the people who were supposed to hold it, and chose to put it down. She was going to need to know what that was, for herself and for Therian both, before they reached that gate. There is something else, Therian said. His voice had changed register, not the factual register of the tactical conversation, Something under it now, lower and less controlled. She looked at him. The information Rael sent, he said. It included the content of the conversation at the way station. He stopped, started again. Not all of it? The clan information, the gate meeting proposal, the tactical elements. He held her eyes. Not the fire conversation. Not... He stopped again. Not what you told me about the noise, she said. No. She held that. The distinction mattered, and they both knew it mattered, and neither of them said why it mattered because the fire was moving and the garrison was not empty. And some things did not need to be said to be understood between two people who were both, in their different ways, extremely careful about what they gave to the world to interpret. Good, she said. He looked at her. Tomorrow, she said, we send Rael the false information before we break camp. Give him the night to carry it. She looked at the fire. And then we ride. He nodded, once. She turned toward the sleeping area and then stopped, because there was one thing left, and it was the kind of thing that mattered more for being said plainly rather than allowed to remain implied. Therian. He looked at her. When we reach that gate, she said, and the clan leaders are standing there with Dael's wrong preparation in their heads, and my 3 days of road on my body. You cannot speak for me. You cannot position me or frame me or offer context. She held his gaze and made it steady. Whatever I am, at that gate, it has to be only what I am. If you stand in front of it, even once, we lose everything I have built on this road. The silence stretched. I know, he said. Say it clearly, she said. Not because I don't believe you, because we both need to hear it said clearly before we arrive. He held her eyes through the firelight, and the weight in his expression was the weight of a man who was very good at protecting things, and was being asked to stand with his hands at his sides, and let something he valued stand without protection in front of people who had already decided to damage it. When we reach that gate, he said, I will stand behind you. She held it. Then we have a chance, she said. She walked to the sleeping area and lay down and looked at the ceiling and felt the road in every part of her body that had a complaint about the road, which was most of them, and she thought about Rael and what it cost to betray 11 years, and she thought about Dael preparing his formal council arguments in a camp 3 days north, satisfied with the intelligence he had received, building a wall that was already fitted to the wrong dimensions. She thought about the gate. She thought about standing in front of 6 people who had already said no, and the man behind her keeping his hands at his sides. She thought about the dress under the coat and what it would look like in morning light after 3 days on a frontier road, and she thought that it would look like exactly what it was. She closed her eyes, and did not hear the sound of Murray moving to the door and speaking quietly to the senior remaining guard, or the guard's response, or the particular quality of silence that followed. The silence of 2 people who had just confirmed something they had been watching for and were now deciding what to do with it. She did not hear it, and that, as she would understand only when it was almost too late, was the mistake that none of her calculations on the road north had accounted for. Moret had been at the way station too. Moret had heard everything. She found out about Murray at dawn. Not from Therian, not from the garrison guards. She found out because she woke before the light and lay still in the dark with the road ache in her body and the specific alertness of someone who had slept 4 hours in a place that was not safe in the way she had initially assessed it, and she listened, and in the listening she heard the quality of the silence outside the sleeping area door and understood that the silence had a shape that did not match the garrison. She rose without sound, pulled the coat on, moved to the door. The garrison's main room was empty in a way it had not been when she went to sleep. The 2 guards who had been assigned overnight positions were not at their positions. The fire had burned low without anyone feeding it, which meant it had been burning low for longer than a watch rotation should have allowed. Murray was at the table. She was not doing anything incriminating. She was sitting with a canteen and her hands flat on the table surface, and she looked up when Seraphine came through the door, and she did not look away, which was its own information. Seraphine stood in the doorway and looked at her. How much? Seraphine said. Murray held her eyes. Everything from the second day. The fire was low and orange, and the cold from the door behind Seraphine was moving into the room, and she stood in it and absorbed the specific weight of this new geometry. Not Rael alone. Rael and Mireille. Which meant the false information she had asked Therion to send through Rael was false information that Mireille also knew was false, which meant Dael of Clan Vorn had two sources, and one of them was about to tell him that the other one had been turned. The entire second layer of the strategy was already open. "Who approached you first?" Seraphine said. "Dael's man, 8 months ago." Mara's voice was flat and without performance, the voice of someone who had decided to be done with the maintenance of a position. Before the king started riding south with frequency, before anyone knew you existed. What did he offer you? Clan Scaer citizenship, land grant in the valley. A pause that was not hesitation but placement, the careful positioning of a true thing. "My daughter is in Scaer territory, has been for 6 years. I have been riding border patrol and sending money north and seeing her twice a year if the passes cooperate. The flatness did not change. Dael's man offered me land and standing and the ability to stop being someone who passes through and start being someone who stays." Seraphine held the full weight of it, not the betrayal, the reason for the betrayal, which was not ideology or ambition or the abstract loyalty to a cause. It was a daughter in Scaer territory and 6 years of twice-yearly visits and the specific mathematics of a woman who had been calculating what she was willing to do to close that distance. She understood that mathematics in her body. "Where's Therion?" she said. "East room, sleeping." Marit's eyes had not moved from her face. "I did not give them the fire conversation. I want you to know that." "Why?" "Because it was not mine to give." A beat. Some things are not anyone's to give. Seraphine looked at her for a long moment. Mireille looked back with the steadiness of someone who was not asking for anything, who had laid out the accounting and was waiting for the result without attempting to influence it. "Dael knows the false information is false," Seraphine said. "He will by mid-morning. I sent word at midnight." "Then he knows we know about Rael." "Yes, and he will assume I have no remaining strategy at the gate," she breathed. "He will arrive prepared for a woman who has run out of moves." "That is my assessment," Miret said. Seraphine was quiet for a moment. That was not hesitation. She was looking at the problem the way she looked at all problems that had exceeded their original parameters, not trying to salvage the failed version, but finding the shape of what the new version required. The plan was gone, both layers of it. What remained was the gate and the road, and 2 more days, and the things she had said to Therion in the garrison firelight that she had not fully understood when she said it. "Whatever I am at that gate, it has to be only what I am." She had meant it as a tactical instruction. She understood now it was the only thing she had left. "Wake Therion," she said. Miret rose. "And Mireille." She waited until the frontier woman had turned. "The land grant and the citizenship. Tell Dael's man they stand, regardless of what happens at the gate. That is not my decision to make for your daughter." Mireille looked at her. "Tell him I said so," Seraphine said. "He'll want to know I know." Mireille went to wake the king. Therion came through the door 2 minutes later with the look of a man who had received the summary in 20 seconds and arrived already past the initial reaction into the operational question. He looked at Seraphine. She looked at him. They did not spend time on the geography of how wrong it had gone because the geography was obvious, and the citadel was 2 days north, and neither of those facts was going to change by being discussed. "Rael," he said. "Leave him," she said. Same reason as before, except now he's not a channel for false information. He's a witness. To what? To everything that happens at the gate. She held his eyes. "When this is over, I want everyone who chose the wrong side to have seen it happen with their own eyes. I want the account to be theirs." He absorbed this. "You're assuming there's a right side to be on by the time we reach the gate." "I'm not assuming anything," she said. "I'm riding toward it anyway." Something moved in his face, the same thing she had seen in the firelight, surfacing, then going back under. "Seraphine, don't." She said it without edge, without the sharpness that the word could have carried. "Don't position it. Don't tell me what we're riding into. I know what we're riding into." She looked at him steadily in the low fire and the early gray of morning coming through the garrison's single window. "What I need from you right now is to break camp and ride." He looked at her for a moment that was longer than strategic and shorter than everything it contained. "Break camp," he said to the room. They rode out before full light, into a morning that had decided to be honest about its intentions and produced a wind that came off the northern peaks without any of the previous day's restraint. It was not a storm. It was colder than a storm, colder in the sustained, patient way that the frontier cold was cold. Not trying to break anything, just present, just itself, just the baseline condition of existing at this latitude at this season. Seraphine rode into it. She was past the point where the cold was an event. It had become weather in the truest sense, something she moved through rather than something she experienced. Her body had made its accommodation, and the accommodation held, not comfortably, but functionally, the way the body made all its serious accommodations. Not by becoming comfortable with difficulty, but by expanding the definition of what was workable. The valley narrowed in the second day's riding. The river was on their left, and the mountain flanks pressed closer on both sides, and the road began to show evidence of maintenance. Not southern maintenance, not the carefully graded and drained roads that connected the empire's southern cities, but frontier maintenance, purposeful and without aesthetics. Rock cleared from the surface and drainage channels cut, and bridges that were built to function in ice melt without any interest in what they looked like while functioning. People had done this work. People who intended to stay. She thought about that, about what it meant to maintain a road you were going to keep using, in a place that tried every winter to return to a state that did not include the road, the specific stubbornness of that, the refusal to let the terrain win by attrition. She thought about Haldra, 70 years old, who had been maintaining roads like this her whole life, who had buried children in the territory the road ran through and kept maintaining the road anyway. She thought about what she was going to say at the gate. She had been thinking about it for 2 days, and she still did not have the words. She was beginning to understand that this was correct. The words that were prepared were the words that sounded prepared, and Haldra in particular would hear the preparation in them and weigh it accordingly. What she needed at the gate was not a speech. She did not know yet what she needed. She was trying to trust that she would know when she was standing in it. It was not a comfortable way to approach the most significant confrontation of her life. It was the only honest one. They came to the citadel in the late afternoon of the second day, and she understood immediately why it was called Black Spire. It rose from the valley floor without preamble, without the graduated architectural approach of southern fortresses that announced themselves from a distance with walls and towers and the accumulated communication of importance. Black Spire simply arrived, a mass of dark stone that the mountains behind it had apparently shed at some point in the geological past, and that someone had recognized with the specific frontier practicality of people who used what the land provided, as already most of a fortress. The spire itself was the natural rock formation at the summit, black granite that caught no light and returned nothing, pointing at a sky it had no interest in. Around its base, and built into its flanks, the human construction was massive and functional, and completely without the architectural sentimentality of the South. Walls where walls were needed, gates where passage was required. Nothing else. 4,000 people lived inside it, and in the settlement sprawl at its feet, and as they came down the final approach road, she could see smoke from that many lives rising into the gray afternoon air, and she could see figures on the walls, and she could see that word had arrived ahead of them because the settlement at the citadel's base had a quality of arranged attention. People positioned not randomly, but with the deliberate casualness of people who had chosen their vantage points and were maintaining them. Everyone was watching. The gate was iron, old iron, the kind that had oxidized at its surface into something that was not quite rust, but was the color of old blood, set in stone that had been standing longer than the Empire had a name for what it was doing at this frontier. It was open. Both halves of it, the full width, which was wide enough for a supply wagon and its team and still have room on both sides. 6 people stood in front of it, not inside it, not behind it. In front of it, in the open space between the settlement edge and the gate itself, which meant they had come out to meet her rather than making her come through to them, which was a position she had not anticipated and which she read quickly as a statement that was not about welcome. They had come out because coming out was a way of saying, "We are not in your territory." They were standing on the approach road, on the ground between the gate and the world outside it, on the ground that belonged to neither the citadel nor the outside, but to the threshold between them. They were telling her she was not inside yet. She rode toward them and did not change pace. Haldra was easy to identify. Not by age, though the age was visible. 70 years carried into the frontier cold, with the specific posture of a woman who had long since stopped spending energy on the performance of vigor and was simply vertical because vertical was what the situation required. She was small and very still, and her eyes, when they found Seraphine at a distance of 30 yards, were gray in the way that old ice was gray. Dense, layered, containing more information than surface inspection could account for. Dale was beside her and slightly forward, which was its own communication. He was tall in the way that confident men were sometimes tall, aware of it without deploying it theatrically. He had the specific quality of a man who had organized something complex and was waiting to see how the execution matched his model. His eyes moved from Seraphine to Therian and back to Seraphine, and in the movement she read the reassessment happening, the rapid processing of a man whose intelligence package had just been complicated by the actual physical presence of the subject. She had learned something in 31 years of being underestimated. The people who underestimated you on the basis of information always had one moment, when they saw you in the actual, of recalibration. That moment was not advantage yet. It was only a window. What you did in it determined whether it became advantage or simply became the moment where they updated their model and continued. She rode to 10 feet and stopped. She did not dismount. She sat the horse in the coat that was not hers over the dress that was 3 days old and had crossed the Skyle Pass in it, and she looked at the 6 people in front of the iron gate, and she waited. Dial spoke first. Lady Voss. His voice was the voice she had expected from Maret's description, controlled, carrying, with the inflection of a man who understood language as a tool and kept it well maintained. The message we received said you intended a formal council meeting, inside. The message was wrong, she said. His jaw moved slightly. You were told what someone wanted you to be told, she said. I am telling you what I want. The silence that followed was not the silence of insult processing. It was the silence of 6 people recalibrating simultaneously, and in the recalibration she could feel the fractures that she had hoped would be there. The slight separation between Diel's recovery speed and Haldra's, the way 2 of the 4 secondary leaders looked briefly at each other in the register of people who were checking whether the other one had the same question. She dismounted. She did it without ceremony, the way you dismounted after 3 days of hard riding, with the careful management of a body that had earned its complaints and was not going to be theatrical about it. Her left knee registered its specific objection when her boots hit the frozen ground, and she absorbed it without showing it and stood. She walked to 5 feet from Haldra. She looked at the old woman directly. I know what you were told about me, she said. I know who told you and when and what they said. She held Haldra's gray eyes. I'm not going to tell you it was wrong. Most of it was accurate. I have no northern bloodline, no military record, no political relationships in this territory. I was discarded publicly by a southern lord 3 days ago, and I rode away from it with 6 riders and no caravan and a coat that belongs to someone else. She felt the cold against her face and the weight of the gate behind the 6 people in front of her. Everything they told you about what I am not, they told you correctly. Nobody spoke. What they did not tell you, she said, is what I am. Haldra's eyes had not moved from her face. They were reading something, assessing in the deep, unhurried way of a woman who had made consequential decisions about people for 70 years and had survived being wrong about them. So tell me, Haldra said. Her voice was lower than Seraphine had expected. Not weak, recessed, held back, like a fire that was burning at a temperature it did not need to advertise. Seraphine held her gaze. I am someone who was told she was not enough, she said, repeatedly, by people who needed me to believe it because it was useful to them. She felt the words landing in her body before they reached the air, felt the truth of them in the specific way that true things felt. Not like performance, but like weight. Like something that had been carried and was now being set down in a specific place for a specific reason. I am someone who crossed a mountain pass in a dinner dress because a king knelt in front of me and the alternative was going back to a room that had already decided what I was. The wind moved between them. I am not asking you to accept me because of his title, she said. I am not asking you to accept me because of mine. I am standing in front of your gate in the cold that you were born in and telling you that I rode toward it when every intelligent person in the empire would have told me to turn back. And I'm asking you to look at me and tell me honestly. She held Haldra's eyes without flinching, whether that is the behavior of someone who does not understand what endurance costs. The silence this time was different. Haldra looked at her for a long moment that contained multiple calculations, none of which were visible on the surface, but all of which Seraphine could feel in the quality of the old woman's attention, which was total and without theater and entirely serious. Then Dale moved. He stepped forward and to the side, inserting himself into the line between Seraphine and Haldra, not physically but positionally, the deliberate social mechanics of a man who understood that the conversation had started going in a direction he had not planned for and needed to redirect. Endurance on a road, he said, is not leadership of a frontier. His voice was still controlled, but the control was working now, which meant the ease underneath it had taken a hit. What you have described is a personal journey. What this gate requires is an understanding of what lives on the other side of it. 2,000 riders. Supply chains that determine whether the Citadel survives winter. Political relationships with 6 clan structures that each have their own internal hierarchies and historical grievances. He held her eyes with the specific focus of a man who is building a case rather than having a conversation. What you have shown me is that you can ride north. That is not nothing. It is also not enough. She looked at him. She thought about his daughter who used grain supply leverage 3 seasons ago, according to what Maret had told her on the road. She thought about the information architecture he had built over 8 months with Maret and Rael and the clan coordination that had moved faster than most people believed possible. She thought about the specific intelligence and organizational capacity required to do all of that, and she thought about what a man like that was actually afraid of. He was not afraid she would fail. He was afraid she would succeed. Dael. She said his name without the title and watched his expression process the choice. You did not organize 6 clans in opposition to me because you thought I was incompetent. She held his eyes. You organized them because you thought I was the one variable in the frontier that you could not control. The secondary clan leaders were very still. Haldra's eyes had moved to Dael. Every garrison commander, every political arrangement, every king's man who has passed through this gate in 11 years, Seraphine said. You have had a channel into. You have understood the architecture. You have known who was reachable and what they would reach for. She watched his jaw tighten and felt the accuracy of it register in his body before his face could manage it. I arrived from outside that architecture. You had no prior relationship with me, no established channel, no years of observation to tell you what I would do under pressure. She tilted her head slightly. And then I rode through a mountain pass and asked to stand at a gate instead of a table, and handed you wrong intelligence that you acted on. And here you are standing in the cold with the wrong preparation. Dael's expression was doing something specific and controlled. The control was the problem for him. The fact that he needed this much control in this moment was visible to everyone at the gate, and he knew it. You are standing at the gate, he said. You are not through it. No, she said. Not yet. She looked at Haldra. Haldra was looking back. And from behind Seraphine, from the direction of the settlement and the road they had ridden in on, came a sound she had not been expecting. Voices, multiple, not the murmur of observation, but the specific register of people who were reacting to something they had not anticipated. She turned. The settlement people had come out. Not all of them, but enough. The people who had chosen their vantage points to watch the gate meeting, and they were watching, and the sound they were producing was not hostility and was not welcome, but was something between those two things, something she did not have a word for yet, a sound that meant we are paying attention and we are not yet decided. 4,000 people who had not asked for a queen, looking at the woman in the coat that wasn't hers. She turned back to the gate. She turned back to Haldra and Dael and the 4 secondary leaders and the iron and the old stone, and she felt the cold against every exposed surface of her skin, and the ache in her left knee, and the weight of 3 days of road in her body. And she felt the full specific enormity of what was standing in front of her and what was standing behind her, and the needle of space between them in which she was the only moving piece. Then from inside the gate, from deep inside the citadel, where the sound traveled through stone and distance and arrived at the gate's open mouth, she heard it, a voice, then more voices, then a sound that resolved, as it grew, into boots on stone. Many boots, too many for a patrol rotation, too organized for a random convergence. Therion heard it at the same time she did. She saw it in the way his whole body changed, not into alarm but into something more absolute than alarm, the change of a man who has just received information that reconfigures everything he thought he understood about the ground he was standing on. His hand moved to the blade at his hip and stopped, because stopping was the right call, and he knew it immediately, and she watched him know it. The sound of boots grew, and from behind the gate, stepping through the iron threshold into the cold afternoon light, came Rael. He was not alone. He had 40 men at his back, and they were citadel soldiers, the king's own garrison, and they were not attacking, and they were not presenting arms, and they were not doing anything that could be characterized as a single clear action. They were simply there, standing in the gate between the citadel and the world outside it, between Seraphine and the fortress that was supposed to be her destination, and Rael was at their front with his face carrying the expression of a man who had made his calculation and was standing in it. He looked at Therion. "My king," he said. The title was neither mocking nor genuinely deferential. It was precise, the title of a man who was acknowledging a fact that was about to become more complicated. The Citadel garrison has voted. The word voted landed in the cold air like something dropped from a height. Seraphine did not look at Therion. She looked at Rael. "And?" she said. Rael's eyes moved to her with the specific quality of a man who had not expected her to be the one who spoke. "The garrison will not receive a queen who was not elected by the Frontier Council," he said. "Not by clan declaration, not by king's claim." He held her eyes. "By frontier law, which predates the current crown's northern expansion, any permanent appointment to Blackspire leadership requires confirmation by the garrison command and at least 4 of the 6 clan leaders." He paused. "You have 0, he said. The boots behind him were still. 40 Citadel soldiers standing in the iron gate in the late afternoon cold, and 6 clan leaders standing in front of it, and 4,000 people in the settlement behind her who were producing no sound at all now, and the king at her right side with his hand not on his blade, and the Citadel fortress rising black into the gray sky above all of them. Seraphine stood in the center of it. She breathed. She thought about the Hall of Veyrath and the terrace balustrade and the cold stone under her palms, and the question she had asked herself that night about whether surviving was the same as being alive. She thought about what she had felt on the ridge when the wind came off the north without obstruction and hit her full in the face. She thought about the road and the pass and the ice and the frost grass and the dark river and the garrison way station and the fire and the thing Therion had told her about 3 years in silence. She thought about what you had left when everything else was taken. She looked at Rael, she looked at Dael, she looked at Haldra, and she said, not loud, not performing volume, in the voice that came when you had run out of strategy and were left with only the truth of what you were. She said the thing that she had not known she was going to say until she was standing in the cold with 40 soldiers between her and the gate and the entire frontier watching. She said it, and the word fell into the silence, and Haldra's face changed. And that was the moment. Not the gate, not the soldiers, not the clan leaders, not the 40 boots on the stone. That was the moment when everything that was going to happen next balanced on a single breath in the winter air. The word she said was Skyr, not as a title, not as a political invocation. She said it the way Mare had taught her to say it on the second night of riding, when they had moved past the clan structure briefing into the language itself. The specific inflection that the Skyr people used for the word that meant to remain standing after the ground has moved beneath you. Not survival, not endurance. The specific northern concept that existed between those two things, the state of having absorbed the shift and still being vertical not because you were strong enough to resist it, but because you had become the kind of thing the ground moved around rather than through. She had asked Murray what the word was at the third hour of the second night, when the garrison was quiet and she was supposed to be sleeping. Murray had told her. She had not known then that she would need it. She had stored it anyway, the way she stored everything that came from people who actually knew the territory she was trying to navigate. Haldra's face changed because the word was correct. Not performed, not researched and deployed for effect in the way that Southern politicians deployed cultural references to demonstrate respect. The inflection was correct, which meant someone who actually spoke the language had taught her, which meant she had been learning on the road rather than arriving with a prepared position, which was the only kind of learning that Haldra of Clan Scare had ever believed in. The old woman looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then she looked at Dael. "Step aside," Haldra said. Dael's jaw moved. "Haldra, the garrison vote is a legal instrument. Frontier law requires—" "I know what frontier law requires," Haldra said, in the voice of a woman who had been citing frontier law since before Dael was born. "I also know who has the authority to call the Confirmation Council." She held his eyes with the specific quality of someone who had decided and was now simply waiting for the other person to catch up. "I am calling it, now, at this gate." She looked back at Seraphine. "You want to come through that gate? You go through the council, all 6 of us, in the open, right here." She was not offering a kindness. Seraphine understood this completely. Haldra was not stepping in to help her. Haldra was enforcing the law as written because the law as written was the only thing she trusted, and she was enforcing it now specifically because Dael had invoked it as a weapon while planning to control its execution, and Haldra did not permit the law to be a weapon for anyone's exclusive use. Not Dael's, not the king's, not Seraphine's. The law was the law, and it would be applied in the open where everyone could see it applied, and the result would be whatever the result was, and it would be legitimate. That was all Haldra was offering. It was enough. Seraphine looked at Rael and the 40 soldiers in the gate. Rael was reading the situation with the expression of a man who understood that the terrain had shifted under his own position. The garrison vote had been his mechanism. Haldra invoking the Confirmation Council superseded the garrison vote by precedent, and he knew it. And she could see him knowing it in the specific way that people looked when the legal instrument they had picked up had just been taken out of their hands by someone who knew the law better than they did. "Step back," Therion said to him. Not loud, not with the performance of authority, just the flat certainty of a man who had assessed the landscape and was naming what was going to happen next. Rael looked at him for a moment. Then he stepped back. 1 pace. Then he turned and walked back through the gate, and the 40 soldiers parted and reformed and were simply present again, no longer blocking, just standing in the iron threshold in the cold afternoon. Dael looked at Haldra for a long moment that contained a political history she was not entirely privy to, the specific texture of 11 years of clan dynamics, and the accumulated record of every decision each of them had made in the other's presence. Whatever passed between them in that look was complex and without resolution. The kind of look 2 people exchanged when they were going to continue disagreeing about something fundamental, but had agreed without words on the parameters of the disagreement. He looked at Seraphine. 6 votes, he said. 4 to confirm. You need 4 out of 6. He held her eyes with the steadiness of a man who was not finished and knew it, and was not pretending otherwise. "I am no." "I know," she said. "I will remain no," he said. "Whatever you say here." "I understand," she said. He looked at her. Something moved through his expression that was not respect exactly and was not hostility exactly, but occupied the space between them, the specific acknowledgement of an adversary who was not going to be moved and is not pretending to be movable. "Then speak," he said. She looked at all 6 of them. She thought about what she had been preparing to say for 3 days of riding and how none of it was the right thing because the right thing was not preparation. It was accumulated. It was built from the way station, and the pass, and the fire conversation, and Maret's inflection lesson, and the settlement people watching from their chosen vantage points, and the quality of the wind on the ridge when her lungs had opened in it. She let the preparation go. "I am not going to tell you I am worthy of this," she said. "I don't know yet if I am. I have been inside this territory for 3 days. I have crossed one pass and slept in 2 garrison way stations, and I know the names and outlines of your structures and nothing else of substance about your lives." She held the cold air in her lungs. "What I can tell you is what I know about the only thing that matters at this gate." She looked at each of them. The 4 secondary leaders who had been shadows in this conversation and would vote based on what they saw rather than what they had prepared. She held each face for a moment, enough to make the attention real, not a performance of it. "I know what it costs to be overlooked," she said. "I know what it costs to be in a room where the decision has already been made and your presence is a formality that the room is tolerating. I have been in that room my entire life." She felt the words coming from a place that was below strategy, below the part of her that had been calculating and planning and reading terrain. "And I know that the difference between a room that overlooks you and a room that is worth something is not the room. It is whether the person standing at the center of it is capable of understanding what they cannot see from where they are standing." Haldra's eyes were gray and total and unmoving. "I cannot see your territory from where I am standing," Seraphine said. "I cannot see it yet. I am asking you for the time to learn to see it, not to be told about it, not to receive reports and summaries and political briefings." She held Haldra's gaze. "I am asking to be taught, by the people who know it, by whoever is willing." She paused. "And I am telling you that when I do not know something, I will say I do not know it. When I make a decision that damages something I did not understand, I will say so and I will account for it." The cold was in her face and her hands and her ankles, and she felt it all and stood in it. That is not a promise of competence. It is a promise of honesty. And I believe, standing here in front of 6 people who have survived everything this frontier has produced for generations, that honesty is the only currency you have ever actually trusted. The silence that followed was the silence of people thinking, rather than the silence of people performing consideration. Haldra spoke. "Yes," she said. One word placed with the weight of someone who did not use it carelessly. One of the secondary leaders, a compact woman with scare markings on her coat, said yes. A second, a man who had not spoken once in the entire gate confrontation, and who looked at Seraphine with the eyes of someone who had been counting things she could not see, said yes. A third followed. Dael said nothing. He was looking at the ground and his jaw was set, and he was counting what it meant, the 4 to 2, which was the number the law required, which was the number that made the result legitimate regardless of his position, which was the architecture he had helped build and which had just been used against him with complete legal precision. He looked up. He looked at Seraphine. His expression was the expression of a man who had lost a specific battle in a war that was ongoing and was deciding what to do with the loss. "The Frontier Council has confirmed," Haldra said. "Empress of Blackspire Citadel, by frontier law." She held Seraphine's eyes. "Do not make me regret it." "I will," Seraphine said, "at some point. I will do something wrong, and you will have cause to regret it." She held the old woman's gaze steadily. "And when that happens, come find me and tell me directly. I will hear it." Haldra looked at her for a long moment. "Go through the gate," Haldra said. She went through the gate. Therian walked beside her, and they passed through the iron threshold into the citadel, and the settlement people at the gate's edge were silent, in the way that people were silent when they were absorbing something. And she walked through the silence and felt it, did not perform unawareness of it, did not harden herself against it. She let it be what it was, 1,000 people looking at someone they did not know yet, and deciding what category to put her in. She did not give them a category. She gave them the walk, the coat, the dress that had crossed the Skyle Pass and showed it, the left knee that had been complaining since the first way station and was still functional, the face that had been in the cold for 3 days and was present without performance. She gave them what she was. Inside the citadel, in the inner courtyard where the walls cut the wind and the noise of 4,000 lives was layered and complex and very different from the silence of the valley road, Therian stopped. She stopped beside him. He looked at her. His face had the quality it had carried through the gate confrontation, the quality of a man who had stood with his hands at his sides and watched something he valued stand in front of danger without protection, and who was processing what it had cost him to do that correctly. "You said Skyer," he said. "The inflection was right." "Maret taught me," she said. "Second night." Something moved through his face. Maret was trying to give her daughter a home, Seraphine said. "Everything she taught me was true. She just also gave it to Dael." She looked at the inner courtyard, at the walls and the smoke, and the people who were finding reasons to be in visible proximity to the courtyard without appearing to be watching it. What she gave him didn't change what she gave me. He was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do about Rael?" he said. She had been thinking about this since the gate, since the moment Rael had stepped back and she had seen his face in the configuration of a man who had made a large choice and was standing on the other side of it. "What does frontier law say about garrison soldiers who invoke illegal votes?" she said. "Discharge," Therion said. "No criminal charge if there was no violence, just discharge." "Then discharge him." She held Therion's eyes. "Formally. In the garrison hall, in front of the unit, not to punish him, because the record needs to say clearly what happened and what the consequence was, so that the next man who is approached by someone like Dael's contact understands what the shape of that choice looks like when it is finished." She paused. "And then let him go. Don't follow him. Don't make him into a story about the king's vengeance." Therion looked at her for a moment. 11 years, he said, for the third time. The same two words, but they were different now, carrying different weight. Not the grief of the road, but something that had moved through the grief and come out the other side into something quieter and more permanent. "Yes," she said. 11 years that were real, and then a choice that was also real, and both of those things are true at the same time. She held his gaze. "You're allowed to grieve the 11 years without pardoning the choice. Those aren't the same accounting." He was still. She understood something about him in that moment that she had been circling since the way station fire. The noise he had described, the endless freight of every fear and ambition and betrayal within the Empire's borders pressing through him constantly, the weight of being the vessel through which power flowed and the toll that weight extracted. She understood that the noise was not only the Empire's weight, it was his own unresolved accounting. The things he had not allowed himself to grieve because grieving required stillness, and stillness was not a condition that an alpha king at the frontier's edge could afford. He had been moving for 11 years. She had been moving for 31. "Therion," she said. He looked at her. "The noise," she said. "Is it quiet now?" He breathed. The breath had something in it she had not heard from him yet. Something released, something that had been held for a very long time coming out of him slowly, like water finding a level. "Quieter," he said, "than it has ever been outside of the moment I first saw you." She held that. "That is going to be complicated," she said, "to carry what I am to you." "I know. I am not a remedy," she said. "I am not a cure for whatever the Empire has done to you. I cannot be the reason you can function." She watched his face take the words in without flinching. "What I can be is someone who is standing in the same room with you when the weight gets too heavy, and who will tell you the truth about what she sees and who will not leave because the room gets difficult." She paused. "That is what I can promise. Not silence, not relief, just presence and honesty." He looked at her for a long time. "That is more," he said quietly, "than I have had." "I know," she said. "That is not a compliment to either of us. It is just what it is." The afternoon was going toward evening, and the courtyard was cold in the way that northern courtyards were cold, with the specific quality of cold that was not seasonal but structural, built into the stone, the result of centuries of north wind and shadow and the altitude that the citadel sat at. The smoke from 4,000 lives rose above the walls, and the sky above the black spire was turning the color of iron at the horizon, and something that was paler higher up, the specific winter sky gradient that happened when the light ran out, and the cold became visible as a quality of the air itself. She looked at the citadel around her. She thought about the Hall of Veyrath, and the column she had stood near, and the terrace, and the balustrade, and the cold stone under her palms, and the night that was supposed to bury her. She thought about the question she had asked herself at the balustrade, whether surviving was the same as being alive. And she thought about how different that question looked from this courtyard in this coat, with this road in her body, and this gate behind her, and this man at her side. She had survived her whole life. She had been alive, she thought, for approximately 3 days. The price of those 3 days was everything she had known and all the plans she had made and the careful management of expectation that had kept her functioning in rooms that were not built for her, and the silver embroidery at her collar that was somewhere under 3 days of frontier road and had long since stopped being relevant. It was not a cheap price. She did not think it was the wrong price. Dale came through the gate behind them. She heard him and did not turn, and he walked past her and stopped 6 feet ahead and looked at the courtyard with the expression of a man who had just watched the territory shift under a position he had spent 8 months building. She let him stand there. She waited. He turned. "You said you would make mistakes," he said. "Yes." "And that you would account for them." "Yes." He looked at her with the eyes of a man who was not finished and was not going to pretend to be finished, and was also, she realized, not incapable of adjusting his position. He was not built for conversion. He was built for recalibration. The distinction mattered. "I will be watching," he said. "I know," she said. "Good." He held her gaze for a moment that contained the beginning of something that was not yet a working relationship and was no longer pure opposition. The space between those two things was where the real work was going to happen, and they both understood it without saying it, because neither of them was the kind of person who needed to say it. He walked away into the citadel. Marais was at the gate. She had come through behind Dael, and she was standing at the threshold of the inner courtyard with the specific quality of someone who was not certain they were permitted to cross it. She looked at Seraphine and did not look away, and did not arrange her expression into anything that was asking for something. She simply stood in what she had done and waited. Seraphine crossed the courtyard to her. She stood in front of Marais and looked at the frontier woman with her weathered face and her scare markings and the coat that had been through more mountain winters than most people believed possible, and she said, "The land grant and the citizenship for your daughter. Make sure Dael's man delivers it." Marais's jaw tightened slightly. "He will," she said, "whatever happens with me." "What do you want to happen with you?" Seraphine said. Marais was quiet for a moment. "I don't know that I have a request that has weight here," she said. "You taught me Skyer," Seraphine said. "In the middle of the night when you were deciding whether to keep feeding information to Dael or do something else with what you knew." She held Marais's eyes. "That is weight." The frontier woman's face moved in the specific way that faces moved when something that had been held for a long time encountered something unexpected, not softening, adjusting. The difference between a thing that breaks under pressure and a thing that shifts to accommodate a force it had not anticipated. "I want to see her," Marais said finally. "My daughter. More than twice a year." "Then stay," Seraphine said, "and help me learn the territory from someone who actually knows it. And use your access to Dale's networks to tell me what they are saying rather than the other way around." She held the woman's gaze. "If you want." Marais looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," she said. Evening came into the citadel the way evenings came into high northern fortresses, not by gradual dimming but by the mountains cutting the light at a specific angle and the courtyard going from cold into cold and dark without much transition between. Torches came on. The settlement noise changed character, the outdoor sounds moving inside, the particular acoustic shift of a place where people had learned to measure time by cold as much as by light. Therian found her at the wall that overlooked the valley, where the settlement lay spread below the citadel and beyond it, the frost-pale valley floor and the dark river and the mountains on 3 sides that had been indifferent to human activity for longer than humans had been here to be indifferent to. He stood beside her. He did not put his hand on her. He stood at a distance that was close enough to feel and not close enough to require anything from her, and they looked at the valley and the torchlight and the early stars appearing above the mountain line where the sky was darkest. "The garrison hall tomorrow," she said. "Rael's discharge." "Yes." "And then I want to sit with Haldra," she said. "Not in a council, not with an agenda. I want to sit with her and ask her to teach me something about the valley, something specific, something she knows that I would have no way of knowing on my own." She paused. "I want her to know that I am starting from nothing and not pretending otherwise." She will respect that, he said. I'm not doing it to earn her respect, she said. I am doing it because it is true. The respect is her decision. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you're not what I expected. She looked at the valley. What did you expect? Someone who needed more time, he said, to find their footing, to learn the room. A pause. You came through a gate into an empire you've never seen, and in 3 hours you have a confirmed title by frontier law, a working channel into the opposition's information network, and a conversation scheduled with the most respected elder in 6 clans. I also have a dress that has been through a mountain pass and is not recoverable, she said. He made a sound that was the closest thing she had heard from him to something that was almost a laugh, not a performance of it. The actual involuntary thing, brief and real and slightly surprised at itself. She looked at him. The torchlight was doing to him what firelight did, making the hard angles of his face carry different information, honest information. The kind that did not get communicated during daylight when a man who had learned to manage his presentation had more tools available. She saw in it something she had not had the angle to see clearly before, something that the 3 days of road had been building toward without her quite knowing it. The weight was there, the Empire's weight, the noise that had been his constant since he was old enough to understand what he was. But around the weight there was something else now, something that was not the absence of weight, but the presence of something that could be next to it without being crushed by it. She thought it might be the beginning of rest, not peace, not the resolution of any of the things that were still unresolved and would remain unresolved because power did not become simple, and frontier clans did not become manageable, and empires did not stop requiring everything from the people who held them. Not peace. Something smaller and more durable than peace. The ability to put the weight down, some nights, and stand at a wall and look at a valley and not be entirely alone in the standing. Therian, she said. He looked at her. The noise, she said. Right now. He held her gaze. Quiet, he said. The stars above the mountain line were very bright in the way that northern stars were bright, with the extra clarity of altitude and the absence of the accumulated light haze of southern cities. The valley below was dark, and the river was darker, and the frost grass was pale in the starlight, and the mountains were enormous, and without interest in any of the human events occurring at their base. She looked at them. She thought about the word maret had taught her on the second night of riding, the Skyer word for what happened when the ground moved and you were still standing. She thought about the specific weight of being 31 years old and arriving, without planning to, at a place you had not known to want, through a door that had opened in the rubble of something else entirely. She thought about the woman who had stood at the balustrade in a gray dress, asking herself whether surviving and being alive were the same thing. They were not. She knew that now, with the certainty of someone who had done both in the same week and could feel the difference in her body. What surviving cost you was the part of yourself that knew there was another way to be. What being alive cost you was everything you had agreed to carry in order to remain where it was safe to only survive. She had paid the second price now. She did not know yet all the things it was going to require of her, in this courtyard, in this citadel, at this frontier. She did not know what Dael was going to do with his recalibrated position, or what Rael's departure was going to cost the garrison, or what Haldra was going to teach her tomorrow that would change the shape of what she understood about this territory. She did not know what she and Therian were, yet, except 2 people who had told each other the truth in a series of fire-lit rooms over 3 days of road and had arrived, still standing, at the same wall looking at the same valley. She knew that was enough to start from. The Empire, somewhere behind its mountains and its politics and its clans and its iron gates, was waiting to see what she would do with the place she had arrived at. Cassian Dorn was, she supposed, still standing in the Hall of Veyrath or something adjacent to it, building the revised account of the night that made his calculation look less like a mistake and more like a narrow escape. Miraholt was distributing a story that was changing shape with every retelling. The Merchant Guild connection was doing whatever it did when the thing it had been leveraged for stopped being relevant. They were all still there, the entire architecture of the life she had crossed the Skyle Pass to leave, and it would still be there tomorrow and the day after that, because that was what architecture did. It stood, regardless of whether you were still living inside it. She was not living inside it. She was standing at a wall in a northern fortress in a coat that wasn't hers, With 3 days of road in her body and a word in a language she was beginning to learn, and a man at her side who had been looking for her for 3 years and had found her on the worst night of either of their lives. And the stars above the mountains were very bright, and the valley was enormous and cold, and the river ran dark in the dark, and the frontier was, in all its brutal and indifferent particularity, entirely real. She breathed. The ashen crown was not a thing that had been placed on her head. It was not the confirmation at the gate, or the frontier law, or the 4-2 that Haldra had produced from the legal architecture of a place that had been governing itself since before any of them were born. Those were the external record, the documentation that the world kept of events for its own purposes. The crown was the 3 days. It was the pass and the wind on the ridge, and the fire conversation, and the way station, and the false information, and Marette's inflection lesson in the dark, and the word she had not known she was going to say until she was standing in front of 6 people who had already decided she was not enough. It was the dress under the coat and the left knee and the 4 hours of sleep at a time, and the choosing to go through the gate anyway when every intelligent person in the Empire would have told her to turn back. It was not given. It was accumulated. That, she thought, looking at the valley and the river and the mountains that did not care about any of it, was the only kind that held. She looked at Therion. He looked at her. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left that needed to be said tonight that had not already been said on the road that brought them here. The road had been the conversation. What came after the road was different, slower, more difficult, more specific, requiring things that the road's urgency had not required, and revealing things that the road's compression had held back. It would be harder in some ways than the 3 days. It would be real in ways that the 3 days, for all their realness, had not yet been. They were going to disagree about things that mattered. She was going to make decisions that Dael would document and use. She was going to sit with Haldra and understand things that would change what she thought she understood, and require her to change alongside the understanding. Therion was going to carry the Empire's weight on days when the noise was not quiet, and she was going to stand beside it and not pretend it was lighter than it was. None of it was going to be the version of itself that sounded good in the telling. All of it was going to be true. She looked back at the valley. The stars over the mountains were the same stars that were over the Hall of Veyrath, and over the road south, and over the entire empire from its warm center to its iron edge. The same indifferent burning, the same distance, the same complete absence of interest in what the people below them chose to do with the time they had. She had chosen. The night air came off the mountains and moved through the space between them and continued south and did not look back. And Seraphine Voss, Empress of Blackspire Citadel, confirmed by frontier law and by the evidence of her own endurance and by nothing else that she intended to claim, stood at the wall and felt the cold and looked at the enormous dark and did not, for the first time in 31 years, look away.